Hello everybody, this is going to be a quick video over prejudice. All right, so you can think of prejudice as the affective component of attitudes towards a group. All right, and so you can think of it as the way you feel. All right, that subjective liking or disliking of a group that you might have. And I'm going to share my screen here real quick. We are prejudiced, and everybody is. All right, everybody likes some people or some groups, and others dislike some people or some groups. All right, literally everybody on the planet is. Okay. Now, does that justify being complete and utter bleeps to them? Yes, I just edited myself. No, it doesn't. All right. No, but again, we want to at least understand, right? And so prejudice, it's important to understand, is an evaluation. All right. The action that we take towards people, that's discrimination. All right. So prejudice, that's an evaluation. Do you like or dislike a person or a group? Discrimination is action taken towards them. Do you actively harm them, or do you actively help them? All right. There are individuals that we try to help more so than others, and there are groups that, unfortunately, we don't try to help or even try to hurt. Oh, earthquake. All right, sorry. All right. So that's the distinction between prejudice and discrimination. But what then is prejudice? Well, it's that evaluation of a group or person, and usually when we use the word prejudice, we're referring to a negative evaluation. We're referring to a disliking. Okay. Now, can there be such a thing as positive prejudice? Yeah, you can like some groups more than others, absolutely. But again, usually when we're using the word prejudice, we're talking about a negative evaluation. And so usually when you say prejudice, you're usually referring to a negative evaluation. Now, as I mentioned earlier, everybody is prejudiced. Now, in groups where you have majorities and minorities, and I mean every group literally has majorities and minorities, but when you have groups that are very salient, at least to themselves, and a majority has most of the power in a group, well, those evaluations where we like our own groups more than we like out groups, when a majority has most of the power in a culture or in a group, what can inadvertently happen, although sometimes it is very intentional, sometimes what can happen is that your group that's in power may end up disadvantaging, hurting minority groups. All right. Not necessarily, sometimes, oftentimes, I imagine, not intentionally, but they can do it. All right. And so this oftentimes requires a little bit of awareness, all right, of how we may be disadvantaging the groups who aren't our groups, and who aren't in the majority. Now, why? Why do we want to like our groups and even dislike other groups? Well, one explanation for this is offered by social identity theory, which argues that we have both a personal identity, which is our identity of ourselves as unique individuals, right? And we have a social identity. And our social identity is largely tied up into our group memberships. And one implicit motive that social identity theory shares with many, if not most, other theories in psychology is that we want to evaluate ourselves positively. So we have a personal identity, which we want to evaluate positively, and we have a social identity, which we want to evaluate positively. So we get a positive self-evaluation by thinking our groups are good. All right, we can have a positive social identity by thinking our groups are good. All right. And so our social groups usually aren't usually our friends. Usually our social groups are bigger groups, like oftentimes they're racial groups or religious groups or gender groups or um, regional groups. I grew up in the South, and so I've grown up my life hearing about Yankees and Northerners. So I mean that those are groups, those are social groups, right? And so because we want to evaluate ourselves well, positively, this leads us to evaluate our in-groups positively. So that same self-serving bias that we have, right, can turn into a group-serving bias. So in the same way that we make attributions selectively, we attribute good things to us and bad things to our situations, right, that self-serving bias, we end up having a group-serving bias. We attribute good things to our groups and bad things to outside forces, all right, not to our groups. And what this can cause is in-group favoritism and out-group bias. So in-group favoritism is that preferential prejudice for our in-groups. We like our groups on average. Whereas out-groups, this inclination to have a positive self-view and a positive social identity doesn't necessarily mean we hate out-groups, but it certainly means we like our in-groups more than our out-groups, all right? And so we will do things that selectively advantage our groups more than out-groups, okay? And we can get these very basic, very simple in-group, out-group differences in behavior with very minimalistic methods, all right? Traditionally, we have studied in-group favoritism and out-group bias using simplistic, largely arbitrary methods of assigning group membership in a method called the minimal groups paradigm. All right, you can see it right here. So the minimal groups paradigm is simply a research method for assigning group membership. And like I said, the group membership is assigned based on arbitrary, shallow, meaningless things like the flip of a coin. So you have a group of individuals and you assign them to be in group A or group B simply by going to each one and flipping a coin. Oh, heads, you're in group A. Oh, heads, you're in group A. Oh, tails, you're in group B, etc. Or you might do something like month of the year in which you're born in. So if you were born from January to June, you're in group A. If you were born from July to December, you're in group B. Right? These group the bases for these groups are largely arbitrary and meaningless. All right. In fact, a lot of group categorizations are meaningless and arbitrary. But we can get people using assigning methods as simple as these that I've talked about, coin flip, month of the year, right? We can get people to display in-group favoritism and out-group bias in those arbitrarily created groups. If we gave group A a bunch of money and said, hey, distribute this money among everybody in the study, research shows that participants tend to distribute more money to their own group members than they distribute to the out-group members. All right. Again, displaying in-group favoritism, showing favoritism or preferential treatment to their in-group, which again was defined arbitrarily, over an out-group. Again, an out-group that was arbitrarily created. All right. And so there you go. So here, that's one of the reasons why we might, or at least one explanation offered for why we show this in-group favoritism. Now, does everybody prefer their group over out-groups? No, there's variance in everything, all right? But on average, people tend to favor their own groups more than out-groups. And if we go back to that piece about how does this work, how does this affect the relationship between majority groups and minority groups? Well, even when the majority group isn't intentionally trying to disadvantage an out-group, because they have that inclination to favor their in-group, they may unintentionally, unmaliciously do good things for their group that they don't do for the outgroup. Now, over time, if the majority is a mass majority, those little pieces of favoritism build up, so that the minority, minority really gets disadvantaged. And the members of the majority may not feel it at all right, because they may even come to expect that favoritism, right? The minority, on the other hand, is really getting the shallow end of the deal, or can, all right? And so this simple, basic mechanism may be one of the reasons we see racial strife, one of the reasons we see gender strife, one of the reasons we see all sorts of intergroup conflict. All right, that's it for this video. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. If not, take it easy.